Okay, we're going to do a quick video on the evidence for evolution. In our last video, we looked at the difference between micro and macro evolution, and today we're going to just cover the very basics of the evidence for evolution. So firstly, fossils. Fossil evidence, you will remember in grade 10 when we did the history of life, we learned a lot about fossils, what they are, how they formed, all that sort of thing. If you've forgotten that information, there's a link down the bottom there. You can go and just recap all of that information. Here are some different examples of fossils. So this one over here, this is what's called a body fossil. It's an actual bone which has been fossilized. This is a cast fossil. A mold was made and then that mold was filled with other minerals, creating this cast. And here we have trace fossil, that is a burrow or possibly an organism left behind. Okay, so the fossil record is all of the fossils from the entire world, from the earliest example that we have to the most recent example. Notice that there are merely snapshots in history, and this is because the conditions required for fossils to form are quite specific. Must be rapid burial with low oxygen, high pressure, no decomposition needs to take place. That's quite rare, and so therefore our fossil record is incomplete. Also, we haven't found all of the fossils yet. We don't have enough archaeologists in enough places in the world digging deep enough to be able to find all of the fossils. So at this point, it is an incomplete record. Just to remind you from grade 10, these are the different periods. And obviously, we have fossils extending right from the very beginning, from the Cambrian explosion. These are trilobites, all the way through to more recent ones. For example, the saber-toothed tiger, older examples of hominids, tools that we may have used, etc., and everything in between. This is the KT extinction between the end of the Cretaceous and the beginning of the Paleocene. Just to remind you again, when we look at rock fossils, we can either date them relatively. Relative dating is where we have the oldest fossil in the bottom layer, the youngest fossil at the top layer, and we can compare that from one region to another. So if we've got these three different sites, you can see that this is the same as this is the same as this, which means that these three layers were laid down at the same time. As we move up, this is the same as this, but there is no corresponding layer over there. So these two will be the same age. Then we've got that with that with that. Those three will be the same age. This layer does not correspond to anything here. This layer does not correspond to anything here. Now that could have happened because, for example, if this layer was created all the way across, you can see, although there are these lines here indicating that these are different sites, there is a huge wash away there and there's a huge wash away there. So there is a possibility that this layer may have existed right across and that it got washed away and that a different layer was laid down over there. Again, comparing across different regions, you find layers that have the same index fossil in them, and those layers then help you to date what remains in the middle. So this layer is the same as that layer. It has the same fossils in it, the same index fossils. This layer is the same, which means that all of these four correspond to that one period over there. All right, descent with modification. Descent with modification is essentially what evolution is, or biological evolution. It means that you start out with an ancestor that has one particular body plan, and then you tweak it. And as you tweak it, you get differences, modification. So if we look at these skeletons here, these are modern day organisms. But if you look at the coloration of the bones, artificially colored obviously, you can see the same body plan in all of them. You have a single large bone at the top, which in us, if this is our arm, then this is the humerus. Okay, same bone there. But notice the tweaks. In the whale, it's become very short and very thick in comparison to ours. Okay. If you look in the lower arm, two bones, two bones, two bones. There are the same two bones. But again, notice the variation on the theme. So in ours, Okay, this is your tibia and fibula. What am I talking about? Radius and ulna. Here, notice how thin these bones have become in comparison to ours. Okay, notice how thick these have become and how immovable they have become in comparison to ours. Now, if you think about the function of the arm, for us, the function of the arm is carrying and holding things. The function of the arm for the whale is swimming. When you've got something that you're using as a paddle, you don't really want the bones moving too much. You want them to be shorter, you want them to be thicker so that they are stronger, so that they can push against the resistance of the water and propel you through the water. Okay, these here are your metacarpals. Okay. Again, notice the variation in structure. So in the whale, these have spread out. They've reduced in number in the bird. Again, only in comparison to us. But if you think about the function, that explains why those tweaks will have occurred. So for a bird, if a bird is flying, the more bones it has, the heavier it is, the more difficult it is to fly. For the whale, the purpose of these metacarpals, this is your wrist, is to be able to rotate the hand. You don't really want to be able to rotate the hand for the whale because you want this to act as a paddle. And so therefore these bones, which in a human slide over one another to enable you to rotate your wrist, those have spread out, meaning that there is less rotation available. If we look now at these bones, these are your carpals, carpals, metacarpals, phalanges. If you look at these phalanges, look at the dog's structure. Okay, so this is the forelimb of the dog. Notice that it's walking on its phalanges, not on, in essence, the hand bones. It's walking on its fingers. If you look at the structure for the bird, these bones have become fused. If you look at the whale, these bones have become much larger. Obviously, the whale is also much larger. But in comparison, I mean, if you look at the length of that bone, the length of that bone, in relation to the length of that, in relation to the length of that, the proportional length of these bones to those is much, much greater. Again, why? Because this gives you a large paddle-sized structure, which enables you to then push yourself through the water. Now, these structures are what we call, let's go back, sorry. These structures, where is the word? Why are they not? Okay, these are homologous structures. Okay, homologous structures, meaning they started out the same, but they've changed based on the function that they need to perform. If we then look at analogous structures perform the same function but didn't have the same original pattern. So here, if you look, this is a moth has a wing. This is this is the bat also has a wing. This is a bird. This is a dinosaur. All of those wing structures enable the organisms to fly. These three have homologous structures. This is analogous to it. This structure does not have any bones in it whatsoever. These three have bones. So these three came from the same original ancestor with the same original body plan. They have homologous structures. You can see there's that bone, that bone, that bone. So that would be your humerus. There would be your radius and ulna. In this one, they've become fused. Here would then be either carpals or possibly phalanges, metacarpals, phalanges, something along those lines. So in fact, the bat flies with its fingers. It has this webbed structure between its fingers. This is its hind leg, okay, sitting over here. Whereas this little moth has no bones in it whatsoever. These structures, these veins that you can see here, these are little tubes which are filled with air that give it the structure. But those are not bones at all. So this is analogous to all of these. And these three are homologous to each other. They come from the same basic body plan. Now, when we look at organisms, the fact that we have organisms that have homologous structures and yet have tweaks in them indicates that there is descent with modification, indicates that evolution or biological evolution is taking place. Okay, biogeography. When we look on the ocean floor, we're able to see scars of the movement of the continents. And when we trace those scars backwards, it allows us to see that all the continents originally were one continent. Okay, and that continent then split into a northern continent and a southern continent. Gondwana is the southern continent. And then that southern continent split into the 5 different continents that we know today. But when we look at the fossil record, what we're able to see is that fossils of, for example, this organism here, okay, this is Cynognathus, occur across continents, occur across continents, occur across continents, occur across continents. This tells us, the biogeography tells us, that when the continents were as one southern continent, Gondwana land, those populations existed across the entire southern continent. When that continent split up, then we should start to see changes after that, because obviously, once you've got a gap here, this population here and this population here are no longer able to interbreed with each other. As the continents drift, your environmental conditions are also going to change, which means that the things this population are exposed to and the things that population are exposed to in terms of weather, temperature, seasonality, etc., will be different, with the result that as natural selection occurs here and as natural selection occurs there, it's going to be different. And so, if we go back here, and so you're going to end up with modification of that same basic body plan. So if we look at Cynognathus, the population here and the population here, they would be similar but significantly different because of the natural selection that they would be exposed to. And tracing that, being able to see the differences based on geography, that is called biogeography, and it gives us evidence for descent with modification. A modern day example of this is the ostrich. So the ostrich, the rhea, the emu, the cassowary, and the kiwi bird, they are all the same basic body plan. When you look at their genetics, they are very, very closely related. When you look at them, okay, maybe the exception here being the cassowary and the kiwi, but certainly these three, the ostrich, the emu, the rhea, they look incredibly similar to one another, and they behave incredibly similarly, and they're also all flightless birds. They have lost the ability to fly. So that biogeography, the study of species across different geographical regions, shows us that at one point, because these continents were connected to each other, these birds, their ancestors were originally one species, one population, which then started to diverge as natural selection occurred differently because of ocean opening up between them. And yet they remain so similar in appearance. Okay, so here's just another example. Spiny anteater, the pangolin, the giant anteater, and the armadillo, all related to one another. You can see the same basic body plan is there. Their outer covering is slightly different, and that will be descent with modification. That's biological evolution that's occurring. So this is another example of biogeography. All right, genetics. We've mentioned genetics. Now, the greater the similarity in the DNA sequence, the more closely species are related. Okay, the more recent their common ancestor. If you have an iPad and you open this app, there's a lovely, in fact, you can use it on a website as well, on an ordinary desktop. There's a lovely website that you can go to that will allow you to look at how related different species are. It's nice to go and play with. Right, so we know that mutation provides a source of variation. We know that whatever changes in genotype and phenotype occur, those are then transferred to successive generations. And we know that gene pools can change over time. This leads to speciation. So when we look at our evolutionary relationships, that's how we come up with a phylogeny. So phylogenies or phylogenetic trees used to be based purely on appearance. So even if you dissect an animal and look at its internal appearance, it's purely based on characteristics that you could see with the naked eye. Now it's based on what you can see under a microscope, as well as DNA and genetic evidence. Comparative biochemistry. If you come from the same ancestor, you should have the same biochemistry in your body. So if you, for example, if you have the same DNA that you're inheriting, then you should have the same process of protein synthesis. You should have a common set of amino acids. You should have the same enzymes being made, etc., etc. You should have the same structure of phospholipid membranes because your ancestors are the same. If those things are different, then you've obviously got different ancestors. Sorry, just going back for a second. One of the comparative biochemistry things that separates, or lines of study, that separates us from the other great apes is that we can no longer produce vitamin C. Vitamin C, we have to get vitamin C from our diet. If you look at gorillas, though, and other great apes, they are still able to produce vitamin C. So that is a change that has occurred in human beings, in the Homo genus, as compared to the other great ape species. It is one of the significant differences in terms of biochemistry between us and them. Okay, vestigial structures. These are structures that persist but don't appear to have any real function. One of the arguments that is levied against evolution, against natural selection, is that it is too complex. Some of the mechanisms that we have in our body are too complex to have evolved because there are too many steps involved. There are too many kind of smaller parts to it. However, the fact that there are vestigial structures tells us that actually this does occur, because if the vestigial structure was not there, then we would know that it's impossible for these things to change. But the fact that a vestigial structure is there, that it maybe has a completely different function to what it used to have, or is a totally useless kind of leftover, shows us that modification has occurred. At some point that thing had a function, and now it no longer has a function, or its function has changed. So that shows us that evolution, that natural selection does actually take place, that macroevolution does occur. So for example, if you look at whales, whales do not have hind limbs, but they still have a pelvic girdle. Okay, think back to grade 10 when we did the skeleton, the pelvic girdle, that's your hip bones, those three fused bones, ilium, ischium, and pubis, that form the pelvic girdle from which your legs hang and your legs are attached to. So whales have a pelvic girdle, but they do not have hind limbs. What is the purpose of the pelvic girdle if you do not have limbs? Well, there is no purpose. However, that pelvic girdle still exists, and that tells us that at some point, whales, in their ancestral form, had legs. Okay, so this is a skeleton of a whale. Here you can see the pectoral girdle, there's the forearm, there's the pelvic girdle, and there would be legs here, but there are no legs, okay, in the modern example. The last evidence that we have for evolution is what is called comparative embryology. Embryology referring to the development of the embryo. The development of the embryo, you start off with a zygote. As that zygote divides through mitosis, you end up with that hollow ball of cells called a blastula. That blastula then folds in on itself, which we call gastrulation, which is what gives us the germ layers. Now you will remember in grade 11, when we did body plans, we spoke about organisms having either 2 or 3 layers in their embryo, diploblastic or triploblastic. That comes from the way that this gastrulation occurs, from the way in which this hollow ball folds in on itself. Now, the more closely related a species is, from that point forward, the more similar its embryo will appear. So all vertebrate embryos, for example, they develop a nerve cord, which becomes the spinal cord. They get these what look like gill slits in the neck region. They've got a 2-chambered heart, they've got a tail bud, they've got limb buds, etc. So if we look, this is a little embryo. Okay, here's its head. There is the eye that is busy developing. Here is the spine that is busy developing, and the ribs over here. That is a limb bud. There's another limb bud. There is a tail bud. Now, even human embryos have a tail. Okay, we also have a tail bud. This, by the way, this is the yolk sac over here. So when we look at embryos of different species, this is a fish, this is a reptile, this is a bird, and this is the human being. Okay, so there you can see human beings have a tail, birds have a tail, reptiles have a tail, fish have a tail. All of us have these gill slits over here. In us, our gill slits become our vocal cords. In fish, those gill slits become gills. So the function of each of these is slightly different, but we all have the same structure. Okay, so you can see the eye spot. Brain would develop up here in each of them. Limb buds. Okay, there's our other limb bud over there. Limb buds. And this portion here, which is actually fused with the tail, is the other limb bud over there. So that is comparative embryology. The more similar the embryo, the more similar, or the more recent, rather, that common ancestor has occurred. Now, just to come back to this point, I said to you in the previous video, many people say that evolution is just a theory. A theory, in their terms, means that we've sucked it out of our thumb. For a scientist, theory means that we have evidence that backs up. And all of this evidence that we've looked at, every single piece of it says the same thing, which is that natural selection does occur, that both micro and macroevolution do occur, and that we can see the evidence of this in the fossil record. We can see the evidence of this in homologous structures. We can see the evidence of this in comparative biochemistry and in comparative embryology. When we look at biogeography, both of existing species, extant species, as well as extinct species, which we can only see in the fossil record, we see the evidence of biogeography, that species that were originally one population have ended up looking differently and have ended up as different species because natural selection has occurred separately. So it is not only a theory, in inverted commas, it is an actual theory. It is accepted as evidence. Evidence has been accepted along to kind of confirm various hypotheses, and evolution is no longer doubted by anybody who is a decent scientist.